If we'll just move through and everyone introduce yourself briefly, say your sort of involvement, what your role is and your interest in the sector is. I think we're delighted to have Greg Hunt here from Australia, former Minister. If we could start with you.
Well, look, thanks very much to Katie and to everybody here. I wasn't aware of the 80s challenge until Catherine mentioned it. Nobody said that to me in the briefing. But I have to say, for my daughter's 18th birthday, for her graduation, we brought the family over to Queenstown and did all the things like fun yakking and others. But the real prize was that she wanted to parachute. And so we said yes. My wife said, that's your fault. You suggested it. You're going with her, but you're going after her. And if her parachute doesn't open, you're giving her yours. And so I was free-falling above Lake Wakatipu, over Queenstown, looking at the remarkables. And I thought, if this all goes bad, one, I hope New Zealand has a really good health system. And two, if not, the last thing I'll see is a slice of heaven. So I had to work hard to get that in. But in terms of that, I mean, my previous role was obviously as Health Minister in Australia, Cabinet 9 years, Health 6, COVID pandemic. And the observation before my current work is that both countries, in a world of terrible pain, did an extraordinary job. We're one of only a couple of countries in the world to have had an increase in life expectancy from 2019 to 2021. And so to take Catherine's point, there are lots of challenges, but the reality of our respective situations globally says that we've got an incredibly strong foundation with which to work. And as part of that, I'll take up Catherine's challenge with some suggestions on how to make better use of your private health insurance here in New Zealand and a cooperation and partnership agreement with Australia in health.
Thank you. We'll have a lot to discuss on that. Dean from Expedite.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and privileged to be sitting next to Greg, fellow proud Wallaby supporter. So, and Dean Rikanovic from Expedite. Just got off a plane, an architect by background, very passionate, excited about the topic of transforming for tomorrow. The architecture that I sort of play in is infrastructure, digital and productivity, with innovation as core driver. Most of my work is done overseas, globally. I've just come back from Debrecen, Hungary, do a lot of work in the automotive space. 3 big mega automotive companies that I'm working with at the moment, so you could probably call me the Richard McCaw of automotive architecture, one being BMW in Europe, one being Ford in the US, and a very exciting disruptive automotive company named Waymo. So, I might bring a slightly different sort of disruptive lens to this narrative today. And I guess some of the core principles would be innovation, productivity, and inspired by Catherine Rich's keynote there, thinking bold and bringing new lean ideas and how do we deliver and accelerate them quicker.
Thank you, Dean. Fraser, I assume you're an All Blacks fan.
Yes, I am. But I think the song you're looking for, when you're near looking at Wakatipu and the Remarkables, is Tom Petty's Free Falling. And I'm not sure that the health system should have been on your mind. I think it's more the life insurance system is probably what you're looking for. Yes. My name's Fraser Whineray. I'm here because about 5 years ago, when I was on the Business Advisory Council with Christopher Luxon to Adern, we put up a range of advice, and one of them was on expanding KiwiSaver, which didn't get picked up. So now with this great coalition of the willing and Catherine and everyone else, and it's been brought back into the Overton window, the window of debate pre an election, which has started to kick off a bit this week with some announcements. That's now coming back on the table, and it does need Parliament, not government or opposition, Parliament needs to lift its game and start delivering for the centre, because they keep getting dragged to the sides. And so we have the obligation to push them back towards that place, because it's, after all, it's our country. So my interest is to get the KiwiSaver back onto the table and the super back onto the table, because then that flows into infrastructure investment, it flows through to asset recycling from local and central government, and then it flows through to a more productive economy, which benefits all citizens. happens and starts dealing with that productivity challenge, which Oliver, who listened to a lot of music clearly in the 80s, which Oliver was talking about yesterday. So that's why I'm here. I want to push that. I don't work for anyone, so I can't be fired, so I can say what I like. So I'm just here to help you guys get the job done.
I always like someone who opens themselves up to questions like that. Thanks, Fraser. Moving on, Andrew.
Thank you. Unlike you, Fraser, I do work for someone, so I have to be careful what I say. But firstly, nice to be with you all this afternoon. Andrew McGavin's my name. I actually work for a company called National Infrastructure Funding and Financing. And to bring that organisation back to a theme of songs, and hopefully you will, from what I'm talking about today, you will hear that the government is no longer living on a prayer and trying to get private capital into public infrastructure. The mantra or the mandate of our organisation, we were renamed or repurposed back in December last year. The Crown or the Cabinet recognised that there are some significant challenges in the infrastructure sector, and they wanted to in-house some financial capability and capacity so that we could access private capital and put it into use with infrastructure. So our organisation's role is to partner with the agencies who are building big infrastructure projects to try and get private capital in there. And we're also the shop front for attracting private capital into public infrastructure. And we are the inbound party that receives all market-led proposals for the Crown, not just for infrastructure, but for all facets. Just to give you a little bit of faith, some of the examples of things that we've been doing since we've been on board since December, we're working on a number of PPPs which are live at the moment. We've got one in the road sector, we've got a prison, and we've got the expansion of another prison. We have received as many market-led proposals from the private sector in the last 7 months, which is the same number as what New South Wales have received in 12 months. So it's really good to see the private sector are engaging. And to use the words from Minister Bishop, we're very clear that the government does not have a monopoly on good ideas, so very keen to hear all of those. We're also sounding large equity and debt providers to see if they're actively interested in investing in New Zealand. For example, we're out talking to large players to see if toll concessions might be of interest to them. And then finally, we're also getting into the weeds, and we're not a policy house, but we are trying to help influence where legislation is going so that we do have the ability to pull down alternative beneficiary funding tools so that it's just not always the Crown or the local authorities that are going to fund infrastructure. We will have the ability to actually go direct to the beneficiaries of those, so it makes it more equitable in terms of who's carrying the load. And then just finally, hopefully it's not a surprise, but the Crown's balance sheet is not as strong as what it used to be. Our net debt to GDP is quite high, and the Crown is very keen to leave a little bit of headroom for potentially some other matters that might occur, such as earthquakes. So the main tenor of the Crown at the moment is that our balance sheet should be used for genuine funding gaps. So if you've got a business case in the public sector, we encourage you to exhaust third-party funding streams and non-public financing streams, and only when you can't show that you've got those both on a risk-adjusted good basis should you come back to the Crown and get some money for your public infrastructure business case.
When you're looking at those third parties then, and I think this is both Andrew and Fraser, is should KiwiSaver funds be used to invest in public infrastructure?
Well, sort of turn it around slightly. You mentioned should they be used or carrying the load? I mean, let's present good opportunities to them and allow. It's the perfect assets for KiwiSaver people to hold. There's nothing wrong with a 20-year state-backed inflation index thing. If you're a 20, 30, or 40-year-old, when you're 60 or 70, maybe not. And then you need some market makers to create some liquidity in those, because I think people would feel more comfortable knowing they could get a good investment. They've contributed something locally. It suits their portfolio. And so there's a whole myriad of settings that need to change in terms of asset allocations and KiwiSaver, what you can be invested in. But there's a bit of chicken and egg. Is the capital there? And I think people say there's a lot of capital there, but is it domestic capital that doesn't come with a whole bunch of public xenophobia, right? And that's the same thing with privatisations when I went through that with Mighty River Power, now Mercury. And so I think getting it set up by the government or local government, and then once it's all up and running, asset recycling it, get the cash back there, let KiwiSaver have a crack at it for 20 years. And, if 2 million people swipe left on their phones, you might have 7 toll roads in a hurry. So that's sort of more, I don't know how exactly that works in practice, but that's the theory.
Yeah, thank you, Fraser. And I do not disagree with Fraser, but something that's often overlooked about investment in public infrastructure, these assets have the ability to have a heavy amount of debt in them, as distinct from equity. The debt comes from, if it's a central government project, then the debt would come from government bonds, and government bonds are an eligible investment for KiwiSavers. In addition, for local authorities, when they want to invest in projects, they go to the local government funding agency, and again, those instruments are listed on the exchanges, and they are investable by KiwiSaver. So there is some tacit indirect investment going on, but agreed, Fraser, getting more direct equity investment would be just as interesting.
How realistic is a time frame on that? What's a realistic time frame on that? Could it happen soon?
I don't know. I'm just sort of the interloper. I'm trying to put it all together. But I think the things will have to come together. There's a lot of subtle settings. I'm up to about 80 so far in KiwiSaver. Enrolment ages and contributions and tax, and so it's a real bowl of spaghetti. But I think if we start with how can we, as opposed to all the reasons how we can't. But particularly to your point, I appreciate the point on local government funding and government bonds, and that's a very cheap cost of capital. But in the end, it's also about a maximum capacity on all of those institutions. So they actually have to get some stuff off their balance sheet so they can go and build another road. So then we can go and have something which is progressive and not regressive, because infrastructure tends to help poor people better than rich people. And so that's a really important thing to do.
And Greg, Australia is obviously well ahead of us, both with their infrastructure and the use of private capital and tolling and other forms of time of use charging. When it comes to investment from super funds and future funds, could you talk us through a bit about that and what we could learn from Australia?
Yeah, so we have two major systems here. One is the standard private investment in superannuation. Now it's about 12% is the mandated rate of contribution. And that's grown to well over $1 trillion worth of funds. And the second is there's a sovereign wealth fund called the Future Fund, which you mentioned, and that has itself well over $240 billion, and it has a subsidiary medical research future fund of about $24 billion. I think one of the mistakes is to try to instruct what they invest in, because ultimately these are individuals' funds, but to create the mandate. And so for the government-owned one, there's a very strict mandate which is about pursuing a diversified allocation using the Harvard and Yale endowment models, and so a mixture of stocks, bonds, private equity. They're doing uncorrelated alpha. They are treating it as if it were a private investment fund, and they're getting the results. And some of that is going into infrastructure, but only where the results and the returns are sufficient that they could justify it against their mandate. And it's the same with the private funds, of which there's well over $1 trillion, and they put an enormous amount into infrastructure, but not on a mandated basis, but because that's their safe return. Where it might be 6-7%. Over a long period of time. They're not going to shoot the lights out with that, but because it's a large amount of money over a long period of time. And so I don't think it should be, certainly from an Australian perspective, mandated allocation, but with long-term horizons to perform to the best, with some exceptions like I think alcohol, tobacco, gambling are all off the future funds mandate.
When we talk about private capital into the health system and infrastructure, there's a bit of stigma around the word privatisation. In New Zealand, Fraser, you mentioned the Mighty River Power debate, issues. And as Andrew brought up, well, obviously we are seeing that move towards PPPs here, a lot more discussion about bipartisanship around infrastructure and so forth. But how do we ensure the private sector helps actually support the public sector? It's not about privatisation, it's about funding the building, the capital cost, and allowing the public sector to pick up the running of a system.
So when you look across the world, there's a natural spectrum. The United States is obviously a very privately focused system with, as I mentioned in the previous session, soaring peaks for those that can afford it, and deep valleys of access for those that can't. The UK has a much more even system, but it's very much nationalised, and there are enormous waiting lists and lower health outcomes statistically than New Zealand or Australia. We're both in the middle as hybrid models. I think New Zealand is about 80% public, Australia is 2/3 public, and therefore they balance each other. People want to come as practitioners, they want to be here, but I would think perhaps the three things you could do with your private health sector here, one is in particular to have much greater data sharing between public and private on a consented and anonymised basis. Two, to take up Catherine's point, to look at levers which can legitimately encourage private health insurance. One is the possibility of fringe benefits tax. Two is the carrots that we have in Australia of rebates for lower income earners who take out private health insurance. And three is the sticks of a tax surcharge of 1.25%, 1.5% for those of over 97,000 in income who don't have private health insurance. So to use whatever is appropriate for New Zealand, but that higher rate means lower waiting lists because more people are taking up the private, which then leads to the very last idea of using the private hospitals to reduce the public waiting lists, so public and private. And how do I think you could bring that together? With a 10-year public-private health roadmap, and to develop that with the government. And I could see Business NZ and the Financial Services Council helping to coordinate and put that to government and working with government.
Fraser, you know how heated the debate can be around privatisation. What do you think the reaction to moves like that would be in New Zealand? Is it possible? Is it a conversation we should be at least having? Well, and we're having it around PPPs, right? We are discussing it with infrastructure. How do we have it with health as well?
Well, with health, I think irrespective of which part of what may be perceived as needs to be public sector, it all comes with the same sort of emotional reaction generally from the electorate. And I think we kind of live with a contradiction in our heads, though, which is the state's typically not that good at executing, and you can look at non-tradable inflation versus tradables, or which if you drag it across the page, it just crowds out the economy because non-tradable inflation's running a couple % higher. It's massively less productive, and then that weighs on everyone. So we sort of go, the state's not good at executing, but I don't want it to be privatised. And so we kind of at some point are going to have to bring those conversations together. Now, from the Mighty River experience, well, I'll talk about that just quickly, but there's two different things. One is if you build something new and private PPP gets it going, it's a new school or a new hospital or something or other, then that's quite different to asset recycling, where, say, Christchurch City Holdings decides to sell off the Littleton Port and the airport or whatever it happens to have. So I think the build something new, which is really helpful. I think that's easy to make. The asset recycling one comes into two problems, and why privatisation turns into a four-letter word here. The first is because of what is the use of the proceeds. And New South Wales gave that evidence in a 99-year lease on its lines companies, but said very clearly it's going to go into those roads, those hospitals, these things, and it was transparently done. No one trusts whoever, local or central government, is actually not just going to put the proceeds into whatever their latest hobby is to get re-elected. The second thing is who's going to own it. Now, if KiwiSaver gets to have a crack at it alongside, I don't know, Schlumberger, who wants to build a toll road or someone, then they'll say that's probably okay because there's enough stock reserved for, in the earlier case, Cantabrians or KiwiSaver accounts. So I think if you can deal with those two things, then people are less resistant to it. But the first one is you've got to hold on to the family silver, because as soon as that's sold, that money is going to evaporate because I don't trust whoever's looking after it.
And it's about the messaging to the public, right? If you're saying, if you're Christchurch Council, we are going to invest in roads with this money, it's getting that right, which I think is where the power companies perhaps.
But I think it's even has to be more definite than that. I mean, Bill Inglis said things would happen with the MOM energy companies, and it was kind of loosely, oh, we'll do this with it. In my view, if the government was to sell something now, it would practically have to open a cheque account with the super fund, independently supervised with quarterly reports to show that that money wasn't getting used for something it shouldn't, because the trust levels of what happens with a $110 billion tax bill or expenditure bill are sort of they're just not there. So I think you'd really need to put it somewhere special, and then they know it's only used for the things that were promised.
Dean, I want to bring you in there about how you tie this into something what you were talking about a vision. We talk about that at Infrastructure NZ, and Catherine talked about my excellent boss, Nick Leggett. That's something he brings up a lot, which is we need to have a vision for the country, and it's about asset recycling, it's about asset management, it's about PPPs, it's using all the tools we have available. How do we do that? How do we bring all this together and get the country and everyone in this room having that discussion?
Yeah, look, I think the word innovation, is used in many different ways, and what we've started to realise from a transformation perspective is innovation as a function and not just a strategy. And the function is, how do we now start to make it real? How do we, look at disruption that seems to be impacting some of these decisions that we might be sort of faced with. The whole world of AI is now starting to sort of flip things as well. So, competitive advantage, some of those challenges that we're experienced with from a strategic perspective are now about overcoming them from a physical sense. So when we sort of look at architecture and infrastructure and ecosystems, we look at them holistically, particularly with, BMW and Debrecen, Hungary, a location sort of selected for a logistic sort of central mapping, access to essential economy, skill workforce, but also investing in universities and other infrastructure that create more of a holistic sort of framework to a city. And then how does that organisation deliver innovation as that sort of function, but then overcome some of that disruption that is occurring, certainly in the automotive industry.
How do we start the conversation or use some of those tools you've talked about or from your experience about integrating the public and private sectors more?
Yeah, and look, I think the PPE model is a good one, and Greg, you've had some experience with some of the big sort of hospitals in Melbourne, and I would maybe say VCCC could be a good example of maybe that answering some of that question. So I'm going to probably pass it over to you to reflect that one.
Well, I'll give you two examples. We, as a federal government, had to do long-term vaccine purchasing pre-COVID for flu. And we were fortunate to have CSL, who are one of the world's great vaccine manufacturers with a base in Melbourne. But they were looking at, as they should do, they were looking at what is the optimal placement of their next facility, and they were moving from egg-based to cell-based manufacturing. And so there was a consideration, do they move to the United States? And we didn't want to pump money directly into their capital. We didn't think that was our role. But we did talk to them about, what about a long-term offtake agreement? We've been doing vaccine purchasing for, 1 or 2 years at a time. What if we did a 12-year agreement or a 10-year agreement, and would that allow you to make an investment in your upgraded facility? And they said yes. So the Department of Finance negotiated it. It was done, as a proper commercial transaction. But that certainty of offtake from what would have been the case anyway meant we were able to leverage natural government purchasing to create private sector investment. And then during the pandemic, we were able to do the same thing with Moderna, with a 12-year agreement so as they could bring an mRNA vaccine manufacturing plant to Australia. We didn't put $1 into the vaccine manufacturing plant. We did do 10 years for CSL, 12 years for Moderna a few years later to bring them here. It's a bit like getting Apple to set up a major R&D headquarters in 1990. We were able to get Moderna to do that in Melbourne, and that plant is now up, running, and both of those used the power of long-term, large-scale purchasing to create the certainty which allowed for the capital investment without government having to privatise anything or without government having to dip into its capital and balance sheet.
And that's what NIFCO's saying, right? Is
The only comment I have to make on this conversation is I often wonder why we need to start from the beginning. Is why is private investment required in health? I mean, sometimes we don't go back to the very beginning. And just to give a few little responses from what I've heard talking to investors overseas, I mean, the first thing that it does do is it provides capital relief so you can actually redirect and spend that earlier on frontline staff, frontline clinical staff. Secondly, there's the ability to transfer risk and cost overruns through to the private sector rather than retaining that on the public purse. Dunedin Hospital, case in point. Thirdly, when you get the private sector involved, consortia can often bring in quite a lot of innovation, whether it be in design, technology and efficiency. And then finally, and what's most important at the moment, the private sector has a greater ability to deliver faster. And we certainly need a lot more of these hospitals coming to fruition quicker because the average age of the hospital in New Zealand is over 40.
Fraser, your view on that, I guess, on that ageing health infrastructure, again, getting that investment in it, right?
Yeah, that's right. And what you own as a business or a government, you do need to manage. If you don't, it will turn into a liability very quickly for you, and typically outside of work hours. I've been there. I mean, one of the infrastructure projects we started when I was actually in GM Ops at Mighty River is the Waikato Hydro Scheme refurbishment. That'll take 28 years, and so it'll finish in 2038. And that's what Kaitiakitanga looks like, because you've got to look after that stuff. It was part of the endowment of why it was called Mighty River Power, and it now provides vital buffering for a whole bunch of intermittent renewables that are coming onto the grid. But that takes a long time. And to your point about long-term contracts, the 3 companies in the world that can actually refurbish hydro schemes that were built between 1925 and 1972 and have all the experience, we had to lay out the entire program to say stay. And you can get a manager, you can get a project manager, you can get a lawyer, you can get an accountant. And if we did that one unit at a time, and there's 39 units across 9 dams, then of course they wouldn't have. And of course you can't have breaks. Say, hey, we're going to have a break for 12.3 months because that's what the spreadsheet says is optimal. They'll never come back. And that comes to your point. Then we said, well, rather than us saying, here's what you need to put in, we said, we kind of want this many more megawatts, and now that we've got computers instead of slide rules, we'd like some more efficiency as well for the same amount of water, the gravity we're capturing from it. And then they brought the innovation, which we had to just up our humility a bit and accept that there was a bunch of people who have done 5,000 of these, so perhaps we should listen to them given we've done none. So I think both those long-term contracts and the innovation can be brought to bear on it, but you do have to look after what you own, and if you don't, you shouldn't own it. That's kind of like 101 asset allocation for any organisation. Unfortunately, governments typically only get forced to sell assets, or many organisations do as well, when they run into a balance sheet problem, and that's not the right time to be recycling capital because every buyer knows it.
But it comes back when you're NIFCO, you're looking at the price of a contract of including that asset maintenance cost into it, right? So you don't. Whether it's through the public or private sector, and making sure that's part of it.
Yeah, so what happens is normally you'd go, I've built the thing, I've cut the ribbon, and then we'll walk away from it, and the maintenance goes down and down and down and down. It doesn't deliver or last the 30 years and only goes through 20, and then everyone's doing Band-Aids and tapes, and there's water leaks or sewage going through Middlemore Hospital or something. Whereas the one discipline of the private sector arrangements is you do have to price in what it will cost to deliver what you thought it should. should deliver.
And absolutely, and one of the benefits of the PPP is under a design, build, finance and maintain, is that the private sector is incentivised to maintain that facility for a long period of time. To the extent that they don't, then they will be penalised. People forget that. And I think just to conclude, and this is a personal view, not an employer view, but I genuinely believe that there is scope in the ecosystem for PPPs in the health space, but where I am adamant, and to learn from what's happened over in Sydney, I think the clinical services should stay with the Ministry of Health.
Could you talk us, but either Dean or Greg, about that, those differences there, how those PPPs are run in health in Australia?
Yeah, so you have a series of different models. One is where the construction of the building is jointly done, so really commissioned by the government and delivered by the private sector. And an interesting example is what they call the new Footscray Hospital to the west of Melbourne. Sojitz from Japan is a large investor, long-term holder. A second model is where the ownership of the building might be private, but the hospital is actually public. There's a one near my area where a former Healthscope hospital is still owned by the Real Estate Investment Trust, but it's operated as a wing of the Frankston Hospital, or Peninsula University Hospital as it's now known. Third is where the services are delivered by the private sector for the public. An example of that is St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne. And St Vincent's is a not-for-profit Catholic health entity, and it has a private hospital and it has a public hospital, and it's a private operator who operates the public hospital, and that works really well. The Northern Beaches one, they obviously got it wrong from the outset, is the simple answer. But I'd say any of those three models can work, but you've got to do proper due diligence beforehand.
What went wrong in the Northern Beaches one, and I guess what lessons have been learned when further contracts have been signed? Yeah,
so whilst not being the expert, my understanding is there probably wasn't a sufficient balance between the public and the private. And I think that in essence, the private operator settled for too low, and then they went broke. Really, they in order to bid, they didn't do the due diligence. So a great example is Brookfield Multiplex arguably paid too much for Healthscope in Australia. KKR wanted to buy Ramsay. They had a really good balanced agreement, but they couldn't reach price. Ramsay wanted higher, as the board understandably would. And KKR wanted lower, and they didn't overpay, which was probably the best financial decision KKR's made in Australia in the last 5 years, is, the thing they didn't buy. I think in the Northern Beaches, essentially they settled for a contract which didn't pay them enough to meet the operational costs, with rising staff costs, which are following state-based awards.
Dean, Fraser talked a bit about innovation in there, where that could become, I guess, a bit of a reluctance from some companies to innovate. I don't know how much you deal between public and private sector, but do you find a difference there about who's more willing to innovate and how?
Yeah, and look, I would say, a strategic coherence and having sort of clear clarity and that vision from the onset becomes paramount. Working with some of these sort of larger global organisations, there is a clear driver to what that tactic is requiring, and a clear target. And I think, we see that sort of innovation sort of force being delivered more rapidly, and even with what you've sort of highlighted with some of these PPE opportunities, there is a forced collaboration that happens earlier, and what comes with that is a certainty and program that is expected to be met. If we're thinking about some of these larger infrastructure cycles, continuing for sort of 30 years, that commitment up front and essentially nailing the business case to get that certainty is quite key to that early innovation. So we're seeing a very aggressive, collaborative, rapid prototyping process that's a lot faster. And what used to be 10 years, we're trying to sort of reduce that down to more of a 3 to 5, and what comes with that is a degree of world-class SME input, having the right people around the table, getting commitment from organisation and leadership to drive that hope and to very much sort of integrate that into a program of work.
Do you think some of those mistakes have been learnt and, better contracting models, better sharing of risk and so forth is actually happening now?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a little bit more sort of, ownership to that, and where we've realised that, what used to stop through red tape or bureaucracy is we really can't sort of afford to do that anymore. And there is a need to, rapidly collaborate to ensure that we are learning that a lot faster and integrating those lessons learned and sort of pivoting in real time.
Could I follow up with Dean on that one if I could? So, because you're looking at quite a few different countries here and the ecosystems you're looking at to produce the innovation. But my thesis, I think about it, is innovation does require some stimulation, whether it drives the collaboration or speed or result. And, what happens if you don't get that stimulation is it kind of atrophies because you don't need to change. And that's a history of New Zealand's flora and fauna. It started flowering every 7 years and laid its eggs on the ground and then gave up the will to fly because there was nothing to compete with it. And so then something overseas turns up and it gets smashed. So, because it's not used to, it can't innovate quickly enough because that's ecology doesn't do that. So when you're looking at all these different places, where do you find the optimal set of pressure or biological pressure on a system so that it will innovate as opposed to become extinct? Yeah. Or is extinction part of the innovation for the ecosystem?
Yeah, look, prior to some of the automotive projects, oil and gas was a key sector that I did play in, particularly in, the western parts of Australia. And one of the large infrastructure projects that, I did lead was the Woodside headquarters and Australia's largest oil and gas company. And back in 2013, Peter Coleman, the CEO, sort of highlighted that data is the new oil, and if we don't evolve and sort of future-proof for the future, then we do become extinct. So what was previously reactionary became more proactive, and there was a heavy investment in people, digital and infrastructure to very much sort of future-proof that organisation and to create environments that drove productivity and efficiency. And we clearly remember the first KPI to what that project sort of represented, and that was back in 2015, every time Woodside, pioneered, explored and searched for oil and striked Earth, it found oil 2 times out of 10. And every time they sort of missed, it cost them probably about $280 million. And the key KPI for the investment in, this new campus, this new way of working, was to increase that productivity. And 7 years after that project was completed in 2018, we went back and measured that KPI, and that KPI had seen that 2.2 out of 10 rise to 6.2 out of 10. So instantly a 20x saving on investment, productivity, but looking at disruption differently because it was technology that was disrupting that industry, and there was a realisation that we actually need to future-proof and design for adapting.
Greg, just bringing back to talk about health and life insurance and looking what Australia does there. How does that work in terms of, again, that balance between public policy and private health?
Yeah, so treating health and life insurance as related but separate products. Life insurance has a rule which allows them to take their patient or take their client as they find them. So a 60-year-old person will take more or pay more than a 30-year-old person for the same policy. Health insurance has what I think is a really important part of it within the Australian model, and that's called community rating. What does community rating mean? It means that my 30-year-old self will pay the same as my 60-year-old self for the gold, silver, bronze, or basic, the different tiers of health insurance that are available. And what that means is that a lot more people who are older Australians have private health insurance than in New Zealand. And it's a really important part of that model. So the government's private health insurance rebate, which largely goes to older Australians who are lower income, who self-fund, that's about $6 billion Australian a year. But within the Australian budget, it's pretty consistent. But that community rating, or that non-differentiation based on age and health, actually lifts the number of people who are covered, lifts the insurance pool, and therefore helps, oddly enough, keep premiums down, even though you've got some of the higher utilisation members. So, along with the idea of the carrots and the sticks, the rebate and the surcharge, the fringe benefits tax, community rating could be the fourth pillar of private health insurance reform, none of which is pushing people from public to private, all of which is adding that pool to reduce waiting lists in the public sector, and therefore to increase the health outcomes for lower income New Zealanders, and in particular people from disadvantaged backgrounds, so as they don't have to wait as long for their treatment. So that's why the private sector is really an enormous potential asset, not because it's privatising, but because it is reducing waiting lists, reducing burden, and allowing more investment in the needs of lower income New Zealanders to access health earlier.
And is that $6 billion cost offset by savings elsewhere in the public health system?
So we don't raise a lot from what's called the Medicare levy surcharge, but this is the over $97,000 fee, because it's not actually rational to pay $1,000 in tax when you could spend that $1,000 and get your health insurance. And so most people, there's a very, very high percentage, take that up. They will take up the private health insurance. So it's not a direct cost saving elsewhere. It's a system benefit by, instead of having, by having 15 million people who can go to the private sector in whole or in part for their health, that is taking a massive cost burden off the public sector. And so people who can are contributing to their health whilst actually strengthening the public health system as a result.
What you're talking about with this sort of whole change of approach for New Zealand's health system would be quite radical for New Zealand, right? As an Australian, how do you see us being able to implement it?
I'm very conscious that each health system starts from where it is. You couldn't impose a US system on the UK or the UK on the US, and I wouldn't want to see either of those systems. I said this for a long period, when I was in public office, in Australia or New Zealand. So our systems are close. It's just, if you were, as a policy objective, wanting to increase the number of people who are able to access private health insurance with all of the benefits that we see within the Australian system, imperfect, under stress, like every health system in the world, but between us, two of the best health systems in the world, those are levers that you could look at. The fringe benefits tax, which Catherine mentioned, which is particularly germane to New Zealand, because a lot more of your private health insurance comes through employer-sponsored insurance. It's not a major feature of the Australian system. It's much more direct pay by individuals because of the two tax incentives of carrots and sticks. And then, that gives you a pathway, coupled with the public procedures in private on a contracted basis to reduce the number of people on waiting lists.
Can see you writing notes there, Fraser. You have some thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to clarify. So, is it law over there that you have to offer the same premium for if someone's on bronze, say, that if you're 30 or you're 60, the insurance company has to offer the same premium?
Correct.
So, do they all heavily advertise for younger members?
So the one exception to community rating was something that I brought in is we allowed discounts for under 30s.
Right.
And so there was an incentive, modest discounts of up to 2% per year from 29 to 28 to 27 to 26 to 25. But beyond that, it's common. There is a long-term measure called lifetime health cover where if you stay out of the system over 30 years of age, which is really like your key age, you will end up accumulating a higher cost. I don't think it's a great policy lever because you can't change it, and it locks people in, but it also locks people out. And I was able to deal with many things, but I couldn't change that structure. It was a 20-year structure, and it was locked in. So I wouldn't recommend that particular measure for New Zealand, but all the others I would.
And are there community ratings on any of the other types of insurance?
No, life insurance does not have community rating.
Just, we're running out of time, and I think there's been a lot of talk over the past couple of days around KiwiSaver. We heard from politicians. It seems like political parties moving towards perhaps having a bipartisan approach to KiwiSaver and super a little bit, a bit like infrastructure. What needs to change with KiwiSaver? I know, Fraser, you're big on this KiwiSaver 2.0. Do you think it's going to happen?
Yeah, well, I think the way to get it to happen is you do need something like the 92 Accord in Australia or the Australian Guarantee, where it's not just bipartisan, it needs to be multi-partisan, particularly the parties the smaller parties that pull everything away from the middle, which is kind of a bit empty. And that needs to be in accord so that people have confidence and trust in it, that they will respond to incentives, or it needs to become compulsory, it needs to become bigger, it needs to be allowed to invest in some things over here. There's a whole bunch. Is it auto-enrolled on your IRD number at birth? Do you get $5,000 then, so you can not miss out on the first 20 years of compounding? How do we deal with inequalities? So to get it to happen, first we've got to design what I think is the right what from our starting point. As Greg said, we all have starting points, and then we have to think about how we get enough common ground. And all of us are going to have to Catherine's point, pressure, not government, not opposition, but Parliament, to grow up and deal with the middle, this things they have in common, as opposed to saying, I'm not going to agree to the things we have in common unless I get my hokey pokey sprinkles over here, which tends to be the sort of the adversarial way. We need Parliament, which is reports to New Zealanders, to actually do something, which is, and in some instances, this Accord is going to have commitments that last 30 years, because at the end of this, we will probably end up having means tested pensions, but for that to happen, we can't have people that are 60 saying no way to that. They have to know that they'll be well through the system. That's a terrible euphemism, isn't it? Old enough so they won't have to really worry about that. This needs really long-term multi-partisan thinking, but it's a maturity which we've struggled to get on a few things.
Do we have to take it out of the hands of politicians?
Well, the people need to put it in the hands of Parliament to say, you guys need to actually come together on this. And I think there needs to be a good coalition of the willing, which can speak to left, right, middle, centre, whatever, and over enough time frames to force an accord. Maybe, the worm turned pretty strongly for Peter Dunn when he said the word common sense on that video. So I think we need a bit more of that.
And Andrew, I guess if we look to Australia and the decades ahead of us when it comes to the super and therefore the investment in infrastructure and so forth, it's a good place. I know we like to think we're better in Australia at everything, but perhaps a good place to look for that.
Yeah, absolutely. If I come back, Fraser, what I'm trying to do is sort of intersect between KiwiSaver and investment into infrastructure. And to me, I think I liked your comments before. I think we need an investable vehicle, but to me, the issue that needs to be addressed is how we deal with liquidity. And I think you could go to a solution where you could have the investment vehicle listed, but I still think that there's a way for Crown or someone within the Crown to actually provide the platform to support the liquidity, and I think it's after that that you'll get a lot more dollars being funneled into the right outcome. Because, I mean, my main message for the room is that New Zealand does not lack private capital as such to go into infrastructure. What it lacks is the actual investable platforms, and it's until we actually work out where the platforms are, can we actually turn our infrastructure deficit into a source of competitive advantage.
We do need to wrap up here. If we could just end with each of our panellists, perhaps giving the audience a bit of a takeaway, what you'd like them to think about, what you'd like them to go away with, and as Catherine said, lobby and advocate for.
Well, two brief ideas. One, I've mentioned the sort of 10-year roadmap for public-private health cooperation and partnership, private health insurance, data matching, and then the greater utilisation of the private hospitals for public waiting list reduction. And then the second is between New Zealand and Australia. I did hear that comment about Australia, by the way. The partnership on clinical trials. We should be a one-stop shop and a single clinical trial zone. And, you know, when you put more than 30 million people together, it becomes a really interesting jurisdiction with incredibly high-quality healthcare. So an approval in New Zealand by MedSafe or an approval in Australia by the Therapeutic Goods Administration should be enough for a clinical trial in both jurisdictions, and to market ourselves as a single jurisdiction. And I think that could be very exciting because there's a very large volume of phase 1 trials, but phase 2 and 3, which mean they need much larger populations, would come here to the two jurisdictions, and in particular with the dispute between China and the US, where Chinese technology is not necessarily being recognised in the US if the trials are done in China, being able to do more of those across these two jurisdictions, good economics, but great early healthcare access to breakthrough medicines for people who are sick.
Thank you. Thanks for your time, Greg. I did notice the Australians sat next to each other, really created a divide here.
Look, I've been coming to New Zealand for 10 plus years, and I always leave feeling truly inspired. I've worked, you know, everywhere around the world, and for me, New Zealand still is, you know, big, bold in terms of innovation. And, you know, some of the companies that I've worked with in the past, Air New Zealand, Trimble, Xero are some of the most incredible innovative organisations in the world. So it's here. I think, you know, be bold, be brave, and sort of be together, and sort of make it happen a lot faster than maybe what you've done in the past.
My thoughts there are twofold. Thanks again for being able to be on a panel. The first is, you know, when we think about all these things, and that we're talking about great opportunity for New Zealand and New Zealanders and our good friends in Australia for over a long period of time. So the prize for outcomes for New Zealanders and their well-being and enjoying and having good, fulfilling lives is just huge. And so, but to get there, we do need those things that you referred to in your more later questions. And so I think we need to stop talking about government and start using the word parliament, because I think that's the mechanism by which we're going to get the accords that we need so that New Zealanders can have those prizes fulfilled. Because what gets you re-elected is there's a bit of a gap opening up between that and what is in the best long-term interests of New Zealand.
So that leaves me, and it's not long left as I see on the clock. I'm going to keep mine relatively simple. For me, the message is the Crown does not need to own and operate everything to provide a value for money public good.
Thank you, and thank you again to Andrew, Fraser, Dean and Greg for joining us, for putting up with the Exit Australia, and for crossing the ditch and coming over. Thank you very much. Please join with me in thanking them.